Welcome to Prairie Pulse. I'm Matt O'Lean sitting in for John Harris tonight. My guest today is Michael Lansing. He's an author, a new book called Insurgent Democracy, the Nonpartisan League in North American Politics. Of course, the NPL is an issue we're all familiar with in North Dakota. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get to the book, just tell folks about yourself, your background, where you're from originally.
Well, I live in Minneapolis, and of course, I've been in the Department of History at Augsburg College for about 11 years. I grew up in the Twin Cities, but I also have family roots here in North Dakota. Both my parents went to North Dakota State. Actually, my father played on the 1965 National Championship football team, which started that great legacy. And his grandparents farmed just south of Lankin, North Dakota in Walsh County. And then my mom grew up in Mayville. So I spent lots of time as a kid with family in Mayville and Portland. And, North Dakota has been an important piece of my background, even though I'm from Minnesota.
So you've got that farming background, which of course is really the genesis of the Nonpartisan League. Let's talk about the book. It's a wonderful book. Thank you for getting me a copy. Exhaustive research. We've done a lot of stuff on NPL here at Prairie Public. What's the focus of the book?
Well, the book focuses on the Nonpartisan League as a movement that transcends North Dakota or North Dakota and Minnesota, which is usually how it's understood. It tries to understand the Nonpartisan League as a phenomenon that took place in 13 states and 2 prairie provinces across the border in Canada. It also tries to imagine the Nonpartisan League as a movement that was not just about farmers, but actually had some really powerful lessons that I think have some potential in today's America.
Mm-hmm. And why did you choose this subject for a book? I mean, take me back to, you have to at some point, I'm going to write this book, and how you got going in your research.
Well, I've been a historian of the Upper Midwest and Northern Plains for a long time, and I've always heard about the Nonpartisan League. That story is out there. It's obviously a significant story in Northern Plains history, but I really didn't become interested in thinking about a book, at least, until 2007 or 2008, when I was working with students on climate change issues. And although those 2 subjects, the Nonpartisan League and climate change, don't seem to have a lot to do with each other, it was actually really important for me because I quickly learned as I did this work with students on our campus that in fact we knew a fair bit about the science of climate change, but in terms of creating change in our political system, whether it's change in an institution or change in our communities or change even at the state or federal level, I didn't really understand that much. And suddenly I became interested in the Nonpartisan League and the ways in which regular citizens like you and I were able to have such a profound effect in politics.
And tell me about your research into this.
Well, the research took a number of years, and it took me to a lot of different places. I actually started the research by not focusing on North Dakota and Minnesota, where the majority of sources related to the Nonpartisan League are. I was very intentional in trying to get to other places. So I went to South Dakota, I went to Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, all these places where the Nonpartisan League was really important. And I spent a week in Calgary, and I spent another week in Saskatoon doing work in Canadian archives. And then, only then, after that, did I turn back and spend almost an entire summer in North Dakota. Collections at the State Historical Society in Bismarck, collections here in Fargo at the Institute for Regional Studies at NDSU, and of course at the Chester Fritz Library at UND. And then finally, the Minnesota Historical Society has a large number of documents related to the Nonpartisan League. And so I did a lot of research there as well.
So people don't know what was the Nonpartisan League and how did it get started. Right around 1915 is when we start to see it.
Yeah, 100 years ago, this is the 100th anniversary year, the Nonpartisan League gets started in southwestern North Dakota, in and around Bowman, actually. And there is a small group of socialists in Bowman, and there they start thinking about how they can deal with an unresponsive state government. There had been strong farmer movements, farmer cooperative movements across the Northern Plains since the early 1900s, and of course even before then, the old Populist Party. But these cooperative movements were intentionally staying out of politics. And here I'm thinking in particular of the equity movements, which was both the Society of Equity and the Equity Cooperative Exchange. These farmers' cooperative movements were strong. Farmers were educating themselves. They were engaging in cooperative enterprises, mostly around grain elevators, trying to figure out ways to get their commodity to market, even though they were facing real structural issues because of the power of Minneapolis-based millers and transportation interests. And so these cooperative movements were already present in the early 19 teens. And farmers in North Dakota in particular were working hard to get the state government to create some kind of option, some kind of public option for North Dakota farmers in order to make sure that they could get a fair and equitable price for the grain that they were growing. The Minneapolis millers were they were notorious, in fact, for trying to figure out ways to bilk farmers out of money. That also was a problem because Minneapolis banking interests backed a lot of banks in North Dakota and actually also were controlling the kind of mortgages that farmers could get. And farmers, of course, are always living on the margins. You're dealing with the issues of an up and down marketplace as well as the weather. You're kind of squeezed in two ways rather than a small business person who's usually just squeezed in one. So these socialists down in Bowman had figured out that farmers were not going to go for socialism. That was not something that was going to happen. They were not interested in anything that radical. Mm-hmm. There were small socialist locals across North Dakota, but they didn't necessarily have a lot of power. So they were trying to figure out how to make sense of farmers who weren't getting what they needed out of politics and not even getting what they needed out of state government, and yet not come off as especially radical, not come off as something that would be untoward in these small prairie and plains communities. So they start figuring out how to think about politics in a new way, not based around parties, but an organization that would participate in politics in a nonpartisan fashion. And that leads to the birth of the Nonpartisan League in February of 1915 in Bismarck.
And really, to get power, they had to get people in office, right?
Absolutely.
So that started kind of that next year, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
1916 is when you see Nonpartisan League candidates. First, they win in the June 1916 Republican primary, which was really important because the Republican Party was the largest and most important and most powerful party in North Dakota. And then, of course, the November 1916 general elections. The League sweeps the field and takes over all the executive branch offices. It takes over a number of open judicial seats on the Supreme Court, and then finally it takes over a big swath of the legislature.
It's amazing to think about that now, how amazing that was to get their people in. And what changes happened once they got power?
Well, essentially, because so many of those new politicians were not politicians at all. They were regular citizens. They were maybe leading farmers from their local communities who had been chosen by other farmers from across North Dakota to represent them in office. And so what they immediately try to work to do is to follow through on this platform of the Nonpartisan League, which was essentially state industries. It included a state bank so that farmers could get good insurance that was appropriately priced so that they would have access to the right kinds of mortgages that would allow them to stay on their farms. Of course, it involved a state-owned grain elevator, and then a state-owned flour mill. And state law here in North Dakota had to be changed in order for that to happen. And so these Nonpartisan League legislators immediately start to work trying to figure out how to change those state laws and to get those industries up and running.
And what's the reaction of the big shots to this in Minneapolis and the people that had held power in North Dakota?
Well, it's funny, when you look at the Minneapolis newspapers from 1915 and 1916, they don't pay a lot of attention to what's happening on the ground. In fact, many North Dakota newspapers aren't necessarily paying much attention to the League until that June 1916 primary win. For these people, the Nonpartisan League seems to come out of nowhere. And then, once they are in power, after the November 1916 election, Minneapolis millers aren't necessarily sure that these people are going to be able to do much. After all, they're not the skilled politicians, in many cases at least, that their predecessors had been. But in late 1916 and early 1917, the League starts to set its sights in other places, including Minnesota. And it starts organizing farmers in Minnesota, once again drawing on these cooperative movements that Minnesota farmers, just like North Dakota farmers, had been already involved in. And then the Nonpartisan League decides to move its headquarters from Fargo to St. Paul in April 1917. And that's when the Minneapolis folks are really starting to pay attention, because suddenly the League is not just a threat to their power in North Dakota, but it's a threat to their home base in Minneapolis.
Now, people in North Dakota aren't as familiar with what the NPL did in other states. So kind of take us through the footholds they got in other states and how that went. I'm sure some states were more successful than others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to know that the people who organized the Nonpartisan League initially never really imagined it to be something that would transcend the state's boundaries. They were focused on state offices. They were not focused on local offices. They were not focused on federal offices. they had this very kind of clear goal, and that was one of the reasons they were able to attract so many members, is that it was very clearly organized around farmers' self-interest, regardless of their ethnicity or their religious practice. Farmers in North Dakota were willing to support this platform because it was what they needed as farmers. They needed some kind of terminal elevator, and they needed some kind of terminal mill to process their commodity and to keep that money here in the state instead of having it all go to the Minneapolis millers. But their success here in North Dakota attracted attention from agrarians all over the country. Old-time capital P populist leaders from places as far away as North Carolina got really interested and excited about the League. And farmers' organizations like the Farmers Union and the Grange in other states immediately became interested in what the Nonpartisan League had done, simply because of that quick success. So you ended up in a situation where League leaders maybe got a little aggressive. They worked really hard to try to figure out how to expand, but they didn't necessarily understand the political terrain in these other states. And of course, in every state, every kind of political culture is a little different. There are slightly different issues, and there are slightly different questions, and there are slightly different traditions. So they had mixed success when taking it abroad, but largely they were invited to these other states by leading farm organizations. Some of those farm organizations then went on to continue to support Nonpartisan League expansion, and others ended up turning against the League. Interestingly, the very first place outside of North Dakota where the Nonpartisan League is organized is across the international border in Saskatchewan. And that's simply because of a single farmer who had lived in North Dakota for many years, even though he had been born in Ontario. He ended up in southwestern Saskatchewan on a little farm around Swift Current. And he was back visiting his neighbors and got kind of swept up in the League excitement in 1916, and he immediately took it back to Saskatchewan, where there was a similar economic situation, but of course an entirely different political system, and immediately started organizing a Nonpartisan League of Saskatchewan there. The first intentional organizing by North Dakota's Nonpartisan League leaders focused on Minnesota and eastern Montana. And these were the kind of natural extensions of the same kind of grain growing areas with the same kind of relationships with the millers and bankers in Minneapolis. So that seemed to make a lot of sense. League leaders also pushed south into South Dakota. So they're really focused on those states that are bordering North Dakota first. But then within a year, they send one of their leaders, a guy named Ray McCaig, who had led the North Dakota State Grange. They send him touring different parts of the country. They send him to Nebraska and to Colorado and to Idaho and to Washington State to kind of see what the terrain looked like, to see whether or not the League should consider expanding into those states. And McCaig was writing back reports in 1917 saying, oh, we should do this, we should do that. And sure enough, the League takes off in places like Colorado, Nebraska, Idaho in particular, but then eventually it reaches as far south as Kansas and a little bit into Oklahoma and Texas and all the way west into Washington State. So it has this kind of real reach. In the meantime, up in Canada, farmers in Alberta got really interested in the Nonpartisan League model. They had watched what was happening in Saskatchewan, and so they started organizing themselves into their own provincial Nonpartisan League, which ended up being quite powerful.
So when does it all kind of dissolve or end?
Well, it dissolves kind of gradually. And in the book, I argue that, in fact, there are some real problems. The Nonpartisan League is a movement that's intensely democratic and small p populist. It's meant to kind of involve regular citizens, regular farmers, people who aren't politicians. But in fact, the movement itself isn't necessarily democratic. There's a kind of firm leadership at the top. Arthur Townley, of course, is that leader.
A.C. Townley, right.
A.C. Townley is well known to North Dakotans today as this master organizer. I argue that in many ways he was a good organizer, but he also didn't necessarily understand that a movement that preached democracy needed to also be democratic. And without that kind of democratic streak, all kinds of dissension started to emerge in the Nonpartisan League, especially from these farmers that were active in cooperative movements before the late 19-teens. These farmers had been used to collaborating together in democratic ways. After all, cooperation, whether it's a cooperative elevator or some kind of store, cooperation is all about one member, one vote. It's all about democratic control. And when the Nonpartisan League itself seemed to be less than democratic, there was dissension in the ranks. That is as important, if not more important, than the types of hits that the League takes during World War I. A number of enemies, especially in states outside of North Dakota, label the League as disloyal because of its complicated stand on American entry into World War I. And that means that there are struggles in these other states through 1917 and 1918. But ironically, the League in some other places is strengthened by this reputation and attracts more farmers who did, in some cases, in some places like Nebraska and Minnesota, wonder about American entry into World War I. In the meantime, here in North Dakota, the League got stronger. In 1918, they seized the rest of the state legislature. They passed their program in 1919. They're kind of well positioned for the 1920 elections. And then things don't go well in 1920, and that starts this decline, and Townley starts to lose his grip on the organization. And when Townley loses his grip on the organization in 1920 and 1921, all kinds of things happen. You, of course, have the 1921 recall here in North Dakota, the first major statewide recall in American history, one that I think was often forgotten after the recalls more recently in California and Wisconsin.
Right.
That actually happened here first. And of course, a number of nonpartisan League politicians are recalled, including the governor, Lynn Frazier.
Right.
But the League is not something that just goes away after the recall. Of course, here in North Dakota, Lynn Frazier is elected to the U.S. Senate in 1922. And by the end of 1921 and into early 1922, the League has kind of moved to this state organizing structure in which these democratic committees of farmers in all of these individual states are making decisions and determining what their organization is going to do. And one of the things they do as soon as Townley is out of power in the organization itself is start focusing on federal offices. And they elect in 1922 a number of U.S. senators from different states that either have a League affiliation, most famously Frazier here in North Dakota, or have some kind of association with nonpartisan League backers in those individual states. And so suddenly, the organization is kind of slowly decentralizing. And in some states it'll go away, but they leave this legacy in federal government in Washington, D.C. by sending all these people to the Senate.
And ultimately, the Democratic Party in North Dakota does kind of keep the NPL tag for years and years. Democratic NPL Party, and people like Quentin Burdick ran under that. So it dissolved, but it basically became the Democratic Party eventually, right?
Yeah, there are four places where the League has some kind of long legacy. North Dakota is one of those places. Here in North Dakota, the League kind of limps along into the late 1920s, and then it's reactivated by William Langer, and it's turned into a really important kind of political structure to support his candidacy, first for the governor's seat, but then also eventually to the U.S. Senate. In Idaho, the Nonpartisan League is forced to become a third party. And there, because of changes in primary laws, politicians in both parties were deeply upset by the Nonpartisan League and the kind of genius of this nonpartisan approach. And so they changed primary laws to keep the Nonpartisan League from acting or from taking over particular political parties. But there it forms a third party called the Progressive Party that is very active in Idaho politics into the 1920s, late 20s. In Alberta, the Nonpartisan League disappears into the United Farmers of Alberta, which was the Albertan farmer cooperative movement. But the United Farmers of Alberta take over that province's politics and run it into the mid-1930s. And then finally in Minnesota, the Nonpartisan League becomes the farmer wing of the Farmer Labor Party, which is a very powerful...
DFL.
Yeah, it's not even a third party. It's really the second party of Minnesota politics into the 1940s, and then Hubert Humphrey kind of is able to bring them together with the Democrats. And in the 1950s here in North Dakota Democrats are trying to replicate what Humphrey had done in Minnesota, and they're able to do that finally in 1956, bringing the vestiges of the Nonpartisan League and that name with them into their formal party apparatus.
Of course, we've both seen the film Northern Lights, which got a big award at Cannes in 1979. We've met John Hansen, did a story on him. And that's kind of this docudrama that looks like an Ingmar Bergman film almost. But
Absolutely.
Talk about in the film, they went from farm to recruit people. And that was very effective, wasn't it?
Absolutely, especially when you're thinking about the early days of organizing and going from farm to farm in these places where the rural roads movement was just getting started. So in some places you had high quality roads, in other places you did not. Railroad, of course, is the main kind of means of transportation between small towns, but you have to get out into these rural precincts and organize these farmers. And League organizers hit on the idea of using automobiles to do this. It's the first political movement in American history to really use automobiles in this way and to use canvassing techniques that are used by some organizations even today. And that notion of going from farm to farm is absolutely crucial. And of course, that's what you see in the film. You see not just the kind of good things that happen, but some of the difficulties that those organizers faced. And they did face those kinds of difficulties in some cases. Essentially, the League was sold to farmers in the beginning, which is a really interesting thing to think about. We're used to people that are involved in politics being very ideologically committed. But in fact, many of the organizers for the Nonpartisan League, they were working in paid positions, and they didn't necessarily have a clear connection to League ideology. Some of them did, but some of them didn't. They were working on commission. And of course, the League raised its money through membership dollars. And so that meant that these organizers had to go extract money from farmers who were hard up. These membership fees were the equivalent of about $200 or $250 today when you adjust for inflation. So this was a sale. And you see a little of that in Northern Lights as well.
You mentioned, I know you want to get this in, we do see some parallels today, don't we? I mean, a third party's really never been able to take a real stronghold in this country, but even with people like Bernie Sanders and President Obama, we've seen this kind of anger bubble up over, disparity of wealth and things like that. Do you see any modern equivalent like that today?
I don't see any modern equivalent of the Nonpartisan League today, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. And I wrote the book for audiences not just here in the Upper Midwest and Northern Plains, but for audiences across North America. Places like Washington, D.C. and New York City and L.A. and San Francisco and Houston, places that have overlooked the political tactics and strategy that were essentially invented by these North Dakota farmers. And they've overlooked them because they think of this part of the world as flyover country. So I was very intentional and explicit about trying to argue to those folks to say, look, in fact, there is another way. We all know that third parties generally aren't that effective, especially once you move from the state to the federal level in politics. And so what if there was another way? What if there was another way to engage citizens in the political system, in electoral politics, that in fact permitted them to pursue their interests and what they wanted to see in government, to make government more responsive to them, that didn't necessarily work within traditional party structures? That's what the Nonpartisan League invented, and it's almost entirely overlooked by people of every ideological persuasion. And I think that there's some pieces of that model that could be useful today to people who are interested in change, whatever that change might be.
When we were emailing before this, you said, you did find out some things that maybe we didn't know or people didn't know about the NPL. What were a couple of those that you found out that were kind of surprising in the book?
Well, I think one of the things that was surprising was the role of women. We had always understood that the Nonpartisan League supported women's suffrage, especially when they take power in North Dakota in 1916, and they worked to create some form of statewide limited suffrage for women. But in fact, the League really struggles on questions of gender, and rural women are really important. They're anxious to participate in this movement because, of course, while the Nonpartisan League as an organization is targeting the men on the farm, the women on the farms are the ones that are keeping the work going. They're the ones that are not just watching the children, but sometimes working in the fields and managing the finances and doing all the things that farm women have been doing for hundreds of years. So it's not until 1919 or 1920 that the League really realizes it has to also engage these women. And this is not just in North Dakota, this is across the Northern Plains and into the Rockies and throughout the Upper Midwest. And they organize these women's clubs, and these women's clubs become a really important site for democracy to happen, for people, in this case women, to imagine themselves as active citizens, largely now because they have the vote. They had been active before that in agitating for things like temperance and suffrage, but to work together as women to figure out how they should think as citizens. They did things like knitting and sewing groups, but they also had reading groups. They were reading civics textbooks and reading political science and history to try to understand how best to participate and how also to protect their families and to improve their families' lives. So that's one of the really exciting things that I think we learn. And that's a story that's in the book.
Do you think, you've got about a minute and a half left, things like the Farm Bill that we now take for granted. I mean, they didn't really have those things back then. So does the NPL really kind of help push things like this that we take for granted now, or is that too much of a stretch to?
It might be too much of a
Okay.
stretch. The kind of legacy of the league
Yeah,
into
legacy,
the 1920s and 1930s is really in these senators.
Okay.
And in many cases, they're coming from states that the nonpartisan league is no longer active in. It's these newer organizations that the league was really the antecedent of. And in some ways, those senators from the farm states where the league had been active are resisting some of these federal programs, which have a very kind of complicated legacy. Self-sufficiency is really important in the rural northern plains.
Quickly, if people want the book, where can they get it? When's it available?
Well, it's available right now on a variety of websites. I'll also be here in North Dakota. Thursday, December 3rd, that evening, I'll be here in Fargo at Zambros. On Saturday, December 5th, I'll be at Ferguson Books in Grand Forks, and then I'll be giving a lecture and doing a book signing at the State Historical Society of North Dakota in Bismarck on Sunday, December 7th.
Thanks, Michael, for being here. Appreciate
Thanks so much.
Michael Lansing, the book is Insurgent Democracy, the Nonpartisan League in North American Politics. That's all for Prairie Pulse. So long. Thanks for watching.